Hello, Abba.
היי, איילת, שבוע טוב.
Well, so Abba. Abba, we left off talking about Gaza, and we beginning to become optimistic. We found a victory point, a flag, and a building site with new hope and new direction for what to do. And we talked about cornering off Rafiah, which is still at the moment a very big problem, and how that could even bring and solve some of the hostage problems. But what are we going to do with these areas?
Well, I'm glad you think it's optimistic. More and more, I feel as though reality is becoming more difficult than we'd imagined, and all the problems we hoped we were avoiding, all the pitfalls we seem to be falling into one after the other. We didn't want a prolonged fight. We've got a prolonged fight. We seem to be stuck. We didn't want to be stuck. But we're trying to be optimistic. And we're trying to think of positive solutions. We're trying to create our alternative for what should be done.
I'll add to that one more thing, that you've made a pessimistic prediction, which has already turned out to be true, that anywhere that you conquer, but then don't put something there instead of it, they'll just have everything crawling back into the vacant space.
You're absolutely right.
This is what we're already seeing.
You're absolutely right. And we're seeing that now increasingly. If until recently there was no return of so-called refugees from southern Gaza back to what we'd conquered in the last few months, that's not the case anymore. And increasingly foreign reports talk about larger and larger numbers who are drifting back naturally to where they used to live and trying to rebuild their lives. Obviously, in that case, it makes to some extent a mockery of everything we've done, but it also makes a mockery of our ideas of having nikama, retribution, which was so important to make sure that Goyim, the people, don't realize that you can do what they did on the 7th of October to the Jewish people and get away with it without consequences. But tonight's discussion is going to be focused, your request, on positive ideas, what can actually be done in the areas which we've already conquered. And we've already conquered 2/3, 70% of Gaza. And so far, we haven't yet conquered Rafiah. And let's assume for this evening that we don't conquer Rafiah. We need to address the question, how do we stop people going back? And what do we do positively? Because I think we're all agreeing that if you do nothing, then into the vacuum of you doing nothing, less positive people, bad actors, whether they're very bad actors, such as the Egypts, the worst people, the PA, the Egyptians, the Qatarim, all have got ideas, and also the Americans. So unless you come up with something positive, however hard it is, you're going to get really negative and increasingly really negative ideas proposed in its stead. So tonight we want to discuss what positive ideas, what really positive solutions, how can we put a forward-thinking spin on the area we've conquered. And to do that, I want to suggest that we should be looking at two substantial projects, both projects which are both needed and doable, even if somewhat fanciful, which today hits all the, or better still, checks all the boxes we need in order to have a program which we can start tomorrow morning and which stops the situation reverting to where it was. Let me explain. I talked to you in the previous podcast about how we have to literally wipe the city Gaza City off the face of the earth and replace it with something else. But I didn't say what that else should be.
Right.
And I now want to suggest something which has been discussed, which I've been talking about literally since the beginning of the war, something which makes sense and is eminently doable. I think we should build Israel's second major international airport where Gaza City used to be.
The airport that everybody's fighting that doesn't happen in their area?
Well, for the last 30 years, Israel's recognized the need for a second major international airport. And it was supposed to be in the Western Galil, but there's too many birds that migrate there. They're supposed to be in the Negev, but there are too many aeroplanes that need to practice there. So nowhere is actually the airport being built. And the truth is, this is the sort of area which is an ideal place for an international airport. It is close to the coast, much less of an environmental impact.
Flat.
It's flat, and it needs to be all knocked down. Whatever you do there, what is can no longer be used. So the first thing anybody needs to do is to clear the area and make it something building an international airport is something Israel needs. So it's really needed. It's not something we're making up out of nowhere. And as you said, it's a very suitable area. To build a new international airport takes an enormous area, huge space. They're like small cities, 3 or 4 terminals, 3 runways, many kilometers each one. You need high-tech centers next to it, huge cargo terminals, high-speed rail and travel from the airports. Israel needs a second airport. It needs to be in the south. It needs to revitalize the south. And what better place to do it than there? Let me talk about 3 real reasons for doing it. Number 1, it's needed. Number 2, it can provide gainful occupation, real activity, jobs, for the 600,000 refugees who are now under our responsibility. We can let them work on an airport and they can earn a decent living.
I mean, the refugees will be builders.
Be
They're the ones who will build.
They'll first knock down the rubble and then they'll build the airport. And lastly, it's going to take a long time. And we need something which will take many, many years, 10, 15 years, until people forget there was a Gaza city there. So in the meantime, no Arabs going back there, no Jews going back there either. A large building site, literally the size of a small city, which is what Gaza City was, where an international airport with all its necessary accessories is built on the site.
We wouldn't be closing our eyes, though, and just letting them build what they want and hoping they build the right thing, right?
No, definitely not. It'd be built after we plan it. It's not so complicated to plan it in an area in which the environmental impact is tiny and which the area is now flat and available for
and
land.
under our supervision.
And fully under our supervision.
But with the Americans, for example, would they allow us to build this kind of project, to go into their area, the Hamas's area, and start planning something of this multitude, of this size? Would they support such an act?
Initially, nobody will support it. In fact, let's divide the world into broadly to 2. There's a small part of the world, the decent part of the world, who care about ours and also care about the Palestinians. And they would be very worried if we did something other than give it back to the Palestinians. But their worry, I suspect, would not translate into anything more than a mere finger wagging and saying, no, no, no. Because in the end, we're doing what they want somebody to do. We're taking responsibility, and that's the key for the people there. And they haven't got to worry about it. Then there's the rest of the world. The parts who are far from decent, the part who don't care about Israel, the part who only want to see Israel suffer. And be honest, who cares what they say? They're not going to invade Israel. They're not going to love Israel if we do something or if we don't do something. So let's just get on and do what needs to be done and ignore the majority of the world who don't really like Israel and certainly don't care either for the Palestinians or for Israel. Nobody will like it initially, but nobody's going to do too much about it. What can they do? As long as we're taking responsibility for the people and we're getting on with a project which requires nobody's assistance, then in the end, people will move on. And by the time the airport's ready to work, 10, 15 years time, alavai, everybody will have forgotten there was an issue and diplomacy will do its thing and it'll be a fully functioning airport. You know, I had a thought, people asked me, well, they asked me the strangest questions. What are we going to call this airport? I said, well, at the end of the Marach's period, we had one which was called Ben Gurion Airport. Now I think we're ending the Likud's period of time. They've been basically in power since 1977. They're on the way out. And it's now time to name our airport after Menachem Begin. We could have one airport looking westward, Nutbag, Ben Gurion Airport, and one airport facing eastward, Israel's future, the east, with all the airports, Menachem Begin's airport, facing the east. Maybe us building in the meantime a very high-speed rail and travel link in between. It's doable. It's not even so expensive. We just need the oomph to get on to do it and remember what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to make sure that neither Arabs and at this stage nor Jews settle the area again at this moment. In the end, you can leave a few kilometers for a mixed Jewish Arab city like Ashkelon, like Haifa, like Tel Aviv Yafo, in front of the airport near the beach. But for the next 15 years, we'll be building there an international project which will bring real gainful employment and allow everybody to get on with their lives. That's what needs to replace Gaza City.
So, okay, we've dealt with one of these 2 areas, and definitely a project that would bring prosperity and good money and good business and future to the area, which is what we're looking for. What about our second problem. What about Rafah?
Well, that's much more interesting. And there we're talking about an even more ambitious idea, something which has been actually talked about for over 100 years. And I think now is the time to do it.
So what we've spoken about up to now, Rafah, we just said we're going to make a little blockade next to Rafah on the outer border on the Israeli side that stops the ammunition moving in the underground tunnels, right? We said we'd make it deep enough so that the underground tunnels between Egypt and between the rest of the Gaza Strip are no longer accessible.
You're right.
And that we can know that nothing goes in and out.
Correct. And we can do that with an agreement with Egypt if we undertake not to invade Rafah for the next year. And I want to add to what we said last time. The tunnels work both ways. We've now exposed tunnel entrances from all around Rafah. Just like they tried to attack us through them, we can also attack them through the tunnels. What's more, let me add a further idea. There is no reason, if we're doing things slowly and carefully, not to attack Rafah only underground and not to start building our own tunnels. Our own tunnels will not be mined, they'll not be booby trapped, and if we're clever enough, our tunnels can go straight for the heart of the areas where they're holding the hostages or where their leadership is hiding out. It's not so hard for highly mechanized, highly well-equipped Israeli infantry and mechanized for Israeli Handasa battalions, for Israeli battalions equipped with the right equipment to enable us to bore tunnels which go straight to the heart of Rafah without having to pop up above Rafah, even for one moment. But let's put that aside. Let's go back to the area above Rafah. Now, remember, we don't want them pouring back from Rafah into the area we've taken responsibility for. So what could we do? And here we want to propose a more ambitious plan, something which I said, which Zionism has long dreamed about. And now there are many reasons that it's both the time and the place to do it. You may remember for years people talked about a Med-Dead Canal from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea. I'm not proposing that. I'm proposing
just to bring water back into the Dead Sea. That
correct.
was the main idea.
That was the idea to revitalize. It's a real issue to revitalize and create hydroelectric power with a drop of over 600 meters to minus 400 of the Dead Sea. That is a secondary project. I'm talking about something even more ambitious, which could impact Israel's geopolitical situation throughout the world. I'm talking about something which was proposed a few times by the Americans and by Israeli defense analysts, and it is possible in one of two alternatives. Without going into too many details, let me explain what it is. It's from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, the Med-Red project, something parallel to the Suez Canal, which will run from Rafah or from the area above Rafah, a large body of water capable of carrying ships all the way past the Negev, circumventing Harei Negev within Israel. It can also be done in partnership with Egypt on the other side of Harei Negev, but that's up to the Egyptians to want to do it with us. Assuming they don't, we circumvent Harei Negev, and then we go down, always remaining at sea level, all the way to Eilat. It's about just under, if I remember rightly, 180 to 200 kilometers, 50% more than the Suez Canal.
This has been checked by mathematicians and it's been proven to be...
There is a route for such a canal.
Physically feasible?
Correct. There is a route for such a canal. Such a canal is being costed as well. It'll cost the amazing sum, they say, $50 billion, double that, $100 billion. In terms of international projects today, that's not amazingly large. And why should Israel bother doing such a canal? Let me suggest 4 critically important reasons now. Number one, it'll boost Israel's geopolitical standing incredibly. Many people are not aware of the fact that the Chinese have made enormous investments in the port of Suez, essentially buying themselves a padlock on the Suez Canal, the lifeline for Europe and India's trade, for American fleets wanting to go from the Mediterranean to Taiwan in moment of necessary. The Chinese can, if they want to, essentially close down the Suez Canal if they wanted to. That's an enormous threat to the West, to the freedom of navigation, and to Western defense interests. Imagine if there was a parallel second canal, and one which, unlike the Suez Canal, which was built before there were tractors, built by hand, literally by 10,000 workers over a period of 15 years, literally by hand. It's relatively shallow, it's relatively narrow. The largest super tankers can't go through it. Imagine a proper canal, 40 meters deep, 400 meters wide, which you could have two-way traffic of real large ships you would not only make a lot of money, and that has been tested. Egyptian economy is to a great extent based, or to a large extent, on the Suez Canal traffic fees, but you would also have a geopolitical standing in the eyes of the Europeans and in the eyes of our friends in the East, primarily Southeast Asia and India, which you don't have today. Because Israel would guarantee freedom of navigation. Israel would be able to tell its Western partners, we are an ally, not just asking, but helping you transfer goods and ensuring the security by moving fleets from one to the other in a fast. It takes otherwise 2 weeks to circumvent the Horn of Africa in a fast and unfettered way.
But one moment, this is a huge threat to the Egyptians.
Correct.
There is no way the Egyptians are going to allow something that's going to contest the Suez Canal to start happening. This is a reason for them to go to war against us.
It's a very, very good point you're making now. But the Egyptians are not so quick to go to war. They threatened Sudan with war, and Sudan are an easier enemy than Israel would be, over cutting off the Nile water supplies, and they didn't in the end. The same thing happened with Libya, and they didn't. It's true we're different because they're more frightened of Israel than they are with either Sudan or Libya, and they would be threatened. But first of all, like I said, we could offer to do it in partnership with them, and there's a much easier route if we did it in partnership with them, something which circumvented the Harei Negev from the south rather from the north, and they would benefit from that as well. But even if they don't, let me pose the following problem to you. Israel is facing a real, I'm not saying existential, but a real security threat today from Egypt, probably a greater security threat than at present, than even than the Hezbollah or from Iran. Egypt, unlike its agreement under the Camp David Accords, has more than 3 times as many tanks today in Sinai, according to foreign sources, than it's allowed under the most wildest interpretation of the Camp David Accords. It has 3 armies, armored armies of hundreds of tanks. We have less than 1/2 an army facing those 3 armies. What's more, according to foreign sources which have been checked and verified by Israeli experts in the field, Egypt has built over 60, I repeat, 60 new tunnels or bridges over the Suez Canal in the last 5 years alone, whose purpose can only be one, there's no tourism, can be to move another 8 armies, armored armies, huge numbers of tanks and missile carriers and air defense groups across the canal and reaching the border within less than 8 hours. Even more worrying, over the last 3 years, they've spent the little money they've had creating enormous reservoirs of fuel and weapons alongside the Israeli-Egyptian border. Now, why are they doing all that? You can say, as Matkal of Tzal usually says, is we have a piece of paper, they signed the agreement, they're never going to attack us. These are the same generals who told us that the Hamas will never attack us. How much their ideas are worth, I leave to the listener. Having said that, the Egyptians are careful and cautious, and it's unlikely they'll attack us when we are waiting for them. So first of all, we need to be, regardless of what we do, on our guard against them. We need to create multiple force multipliers to be able to stop a massive Egyptian invasion for whatever reason. There is something else we can do whilst waiting for the Egyptians to decide to attack us, and that is build this canal. Because even though a canal without bridges overcross it and within Israeli territory, I'm talking about something built completely within Israeli territory, which they have no right under international law to interfere with at all, can be crossed if necessary by armor. It's really, really difficult to cross a body of water of 400 meters it's very difficult. It's nearly impossible. And there's no question that it'll put a serious dent in the Egyptians' malevolent plans to attack Israel, which they seem to be doing at the moment. So the second reason is not just to build up Israel's geopolitical standing, it's to stop a surprise attack by the Egyptians, and they are preparing such a surprise attack by all expert accounts. But there are 2 more reasons here.
Yeah.
One is the fact that it would require a huge amount of manpower. And we have, amongst the 600,000 new refugees, experts in building tunnels. That's what they seem to be very good at, excavating. This is relatively unskilled labor. It can be done by people who know how to build 400 meters wide, 40 meters deep. It's huge, but not any more sophisticated than what they're building at the moment. They can do it. They can stay outside of the borders of Israel today and yet earn a minimal amount of money. We'll talk about what they do with that money in our next discussion. They can earn some money and keep themselves occupied in such a way.
Essentially solving the problem of letting them come into Israel to work.
Correct. And I think the last not to be ignored point is it'll dramatically strengthen is the Israeli Negev. We've weakened our grip on the Negev foolishly in the last 30 years, allowing the Bedouin and other Arab tribes to take over land and done nothing about it. If we create a canal, that will allow us to create a massive new deep blue water port within the area of that canal, which means there'll be large, heavy industrial areas, which means together with the airport, there'll be train and travel links and new motorways. And the Negev again will be conquered anew by Israel and become a powerhouse of energy and industry, moving all the dirty industries from Haifa and the center all down to the Negev, where we're far from population centers. For all those reasons, and of course, let us add as well, we can have a tributary of it spun off to the Mediterranean and save all the hotels, which otherwise are going to have to be knocked down eventually because the water's receiving, use the hydroelectric power to bring agriculture back to the Negev. There are enormous amounts of benefits to Israel, but I think the big ones are the ones we mentioned. So these ideas have been checked out. I know that they've been investigated by Israeli authorities at the highest level and have found to be doable. And therefore, I said, if they can be done, and they should be done, why shouldn't we start doing them now and see how far we can get?
So we've got two big projects. We've got an international airport, and we've got a Med Red
Channel,
channeling the Suez Canal and ensuring our safety. But these projects take huge amounts of funds, investments. How are we going to fund such a project? Israel's already running into very difficult funds with the war demands, with everything that has happened over the last few years. How can we now think of going into these scale projects?
Good question, but the answers are not so complicated. First of all, we're not such a small economy. An airport, even a major international airport built over 15 years, is something we certainly can fund without too much difficulty. But let me suggest a different way of looking at the funding of these things. There are two possibilities. Number one, as many people I think, or listeners may know, over 20 years ago, a huge reservoir of natural gas was found just off the coast of Gaza. It's called Marine Gaza. Stupidly, we gave it over to some of the Palestinians. They never did anything with it. The Gazans obviously did nothing with it. Israel didn't allow them to develop it. But I don't see any reason now where we shouldn't nationalize or rediscover these enormous reservoirs we know of natural gas which exist there and use them for only one purpose: to rebuild Gaza in the way I've suggested. We're going to talk about one next in our next podcast, rebuilding the civilian life for the refugees as well. But the big money for these two projects can come from the natural gas, which is there, discovered, verified off the coast of Gaza. It needs the construction of a huge new liquid gas refinery, which can be part of the expenditure, which also will help the Egyptians, who need also a new liquid gas refinery to turn liquid gas into liquids, which then can be transferred to Europe. Together with Egypt, we can become a major supplier of energy alternative to the Russians, to Europe, thus strengthening Israel's geopolitical standing even further. But we can dedicate all the funds that come from this new untapped reservoir, massive reservoir of national gas, to create two projects which will bring primarily employment to the 600,000 refugees and those that join them afterwards.
And a future for this strip.
Exactly. And let me end by one more thought. These projects today are always best built in BOT fashion, which means the government comes up with a plan and doesn't get involved. If the government gets involved, it ain't going to happen. The government needs to put out international tenders for Israeli-led consortiums. There are many, many groups who are more than happy to fund this. Give them 25 years of sailing rights, of port rights, of airport rights, and they will happily construct it. They will take care of the workers, provide for their education if necessary, house them, feed them, make sure they're looked after, but ensure that the project is done on time, on budget, because they get the profits for the first 25 years. Those are all ways which can be done. I prefer it should be done by international consortiums, just like Kvish 6 was, built on a BOT. You build it, then you get the income for the next 25, 30 years. That's how most international projects of this scale are handled, and that's how this project can be handled as well. They're not impossibly large projects by international standards, and many, many firms will line up to bid for such projects. Bottom line, it can be done. It should be done. The question is, do we have the oomph? Do we have the gumption?
Brave enough.
Are we brave enough to actually get things done, or are we going to spend our time endlessly waiting for somebody else?
Or at thinking tables.
we're at here for somebody else to
Right.
do things for us, which has been unfortunately our curse for the last 75 years.
We've still left one thing unsolved in Gaza,
Yep.
and I think it's the most critical and obvious question of all: the people.
Correct.
I mean, we've maybe offered them offered them jobs in these projects from
That's
the
only a
side,
temporary solution.
and we're not actually explained why they would want, why somebody who has been working for Hamas building a tunnel would now suddenly decide to start working on a water channel for
Genau. Right.
So that is going to be the next part of our discussion.
That's probably the most important of all our discussions. How are we going to enact our responsibilities? How are we going to actually act out what we said we need to do, which is take responsibility for the people? Remember, it's he who takes responsibility for the people, he who feeds them, he who makes sure that their welfare is looked after, who can claim that he's won this war. So our next discussion, I think, needs to be how we can actually do it and not just talk about doing it. Thanks for tonight.
Thank you, Abba.